See now.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks very much to the YP for hosting this workshop. I think it's really important to work on our science communication skills. I think that's what we hear from professionals a lot, that it's one thing to know your area of study well, it's another thing to also be able to have additional skills, and communicating effectively is definitely a high on the list of skills that people want to see potential employers. Before I get started, I wanted to do a quick territorial acknowledgement. I'm at the University of Waterloo. Actually, today I'm home, but I'm in Kitchener, and this is land that is the traditional territory of the Nutra-Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. Our main campus and my home is situated on the Haldeman Track, and that's land that was granted to the Six Nations, and it includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. Our active work towards reconciliation takes place across our campuses through our research, learning, teaching, and community building, and it's coordinated with the Office of Indigenous Relations. I invite you to also acknowledge the land that you are on, wherever you might be joining us from today. So I'll just dive right into my presentation. I have 3 sections of the talk that I wanted to give to you. I'm starting with what makes a good presentation, no matter what type. So whether you're doing a poster presentation, whether you have a slide deck, or maybe giving a lightning talk, no matter what kind of presentation you give, it's really important to make sure that you have set really clear objectives and you have identified your target audience. My next section will talk about how to create great posters, including tips for the words and the visuals that you might be using. And then I'll talk about a lightning talk, including some tips for how you can put together a script. And it emphasizes the importance of using a great hook, succinctly describing the solution or the contribution that you're giving, and then explaining how you are qualified to be able to offer those solutions. So we'll begin at that first section. I have 1 slide on knowledge mobilization, and I think it's a very helpful framework to think about when you're putting together your presentation, no matter what kind, because it really provides some of that strategic thinking that you can be doing before you start putting words on paper. Knowledge mobilization really reminds us that the goal of our work isn't to necessarily just present, but to really get the word out about what your work is doing so that other people are able to use that research and maybe improve policy or behavior, or improve the process, increase funding for certain things, whatever that impact that you're looking for. Putting together a great presentation can be part of that strategy, part of that research impact strategy. So it's about connecting your research to those real world impacts. Knowledge mobilization is a pretty large umbrella term that encompasses a wide range of activities relating to the production and use of research results. This includes knowledge synthesis, dissemination, transfer, exchange, co-creation, co-production. These are kind of terms that us knowledge mobilizers use a lot. And the goal of knowledge mobilization is really to, 1, maximize that impact of your research that I talked about. In order to do this, you need to be communicating your research widely so that people hear about it. And then finally, you need to share your ideas and concepts in a way that resonates with your audience so that it's understandable. They're able to take it up, to use it in the way that they need to. This requires knowing your audience well enough and carefully crafting your messages to address what they care most about. And I bring this up because this is really the key to giving a good presentation. It's the difference between an okay presentation and a presentation that really hits the mark. So that's why I think it's really important to think about some of these things, and I'll dive into this in a little bit. So goal setting is your first step. Once you know what you want to achieve with your presentation, then that helps you figure out the rest of the pieces, including who you're going to be talking to, what types of messages you want to communicate, how detailed you need to be, etc. So I don't know how many people remember, one of my favorite movies is when I was younger was Finding Nemo. And do you remember this scene from Finding Nemo where all the fish get caught in a net and Nemo comes and swims beside the net, and because all of the fish are panicking and they're swimming this way and that way, and he says, everybody swim down, and then everyone gets on board with the same goal and they all work together and they push the net to the bottom and free themselves. It's kind of the same thing, that if you don't know what you're trying to achieve with your presentation, you're kind of spreading your energy in different ways. If you're able to focus because you have a clear goal, then chances are much higher that you're going to achieve those goals with your presentation. So I wanted to do a bit of a chat storm with you. So open up your chat box and don't push send yet. I'm going to give you a question. You're going to start typing in some answers, and you're not going to push send until I say push send, and then everyone's answers are going to appear at the same time in the chat box. So I'm going to open up my chat box as well so I can see your answers. And the question is, what do you think some of the goals are for your presentation at the GWF meeting? And if you maybe you're not presenting, or maybe you're not sure if you're presenting at the GWF meeting in May in Saskatoon, but you might be making a presentation elsewhere. So imagine a presentation that you're going to do and try to think about what some of the goals for that presentation might be. What do you hope that people who are listening to you might get out of your presentation? And I'm not looking for really, this doesn't need to be very specific around your particular research topic, but just sort of in general what you're hoping to achieve. So I'll give you just a moment to think of some answers. Okay. Hopefully you've got something written, and we will, I'll push send now. Great, I'm getting some good answers. Let me go through some of them. So making sure that people understand the importance of your work, that's really key. Letting people know that you've been doing this research and getting feedback, that's important. Making connections with researchers working in a similar field. You're already starting to think about your audience, Ali. I really like that. Showing the highlights of our research to colleagues and decision makers. So once again, thinking about the audience, conveying research results and conveying them in an interesting way. I really like that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Informing about water security in a basin, conveying research results, sharing results, ensuring viewers understand the results. Absolutely. Excellent. You can keep going if you'd like, but I'm going to move on. I thought of a couple answers myself as well. I would think that one goal for most people presenting is to really maximize that insight. So something new and inspiring for the people who are reading or listening to you. I would suspect that we're looking for good conversations, good dialogue with the people who are at the meeting. That helps to build relationships. And those can be beneficial, whether you're looking for a career, whether you're looking for a job in the future, or whether you're just looking for that research impact that we're talking about. And I think to go hand in hand with that, I'd suspect that you're also trying to look good, look professional, promote yourself, your skills, so that people who are talking to you recognize the knowledge that you can bring to the table. But like I said, you guys had some other great answers, so there's many reasons. But my point here is just to be really clear with what you're trying to achieve. Then once you've drafted up your presentation, you could go back to it and look at it with fresh eyes and ask yourself, does this meet my goal? Do you think that this presentation is going to lead to better conversations with people? Does it clearly communicate the insights that I have to them? Does it demonstrate the skill set, the unique skills that I can bring to the table? Okay, next slide. And you guys brought up some of these points too in your chat storm. But once again, no matter what kind of presentation you're putting together, whether it's a poster or lightning talk or something longer, these are key principles to keep in mind. So first, your audience needs to be able to understand what you're presenting. I don't think that is surprising to hear, but this means knowing a little bit about who your audience is, knowing what kind of background they have, considering what they might already know, what they need to know, and then thinking about that level of detail that you need to be providing in your presentation. Making it understandable also means avoiding jargon and not overly complicating the words and the phrases that you use. And this applies no matter who your audience is or how sophisticated they are. If you're able to avoid that jargon and express things more simply, then it's easier for them to understand. And it's really important to value simplicity here. It's not about providing every piece of information that you can possibly think about, but focusing on what is the most important piece of information or couple pieces of information that they need to know. And you'll see that that is going to play out in the rest of my presentation. So the second most important thing here is to make sure that your presentation is engaging. That means that your audience finds your content appealing, relatable, interesting. It means that they can easily find your key message, they can follow your storyline, and that you've done what you can to keep things concise and skimmable. That's really important. And then memorable. What's the point of making a presentation if a day later no one remembers what you actually said? So some really key things that can help make it memorable are using visuals on your poster, for instance. Symbols and pictures are actually proven to be easier to process and to remember later. And also for lightning talks, think about a well-practiced presentation. If you are impressing people because you are well prepared, that is going to be much more memorable. We'll keep talking about how to make sure that your presentations are engaging, memorable, and understandable to your audience. So the first step around that is making sure that you understand a little bit about who your audience is. If you've heard me do a presentation, I always include a couple slides around audience. I hope people don't get too bored of this, but I think it's really critical. You know, people are not empty vessels. They come to your presentation with a set of values, with beliefs, with preconceptions. So when you're thinking about it, it's really important to think about how, like when you're creating your messages, how are they going to resonate with the values that your audience is bringing to that table? So for example, if you're trying to engage a group of farmers, for instance, or producers, and they might be less inclined to believe in government regulation, then you might avoid that as your key message. You might instead talk about the importance of taking action to protect water. And maybe that is more of your key focus because you understand your audience and you understand what types of messages are going to resonate and what might be seen as more, it might stir up some conflict. And then you might want to avoid that if possible. I'm not saying you need to avoid it altogether, but being conscious of how it's going to land is going to help you write a better message. Second, knowing your audience can be helpful for determining the appropriate tone and voice of your presentation. So think about if you're writing a peer-reviewed journal article, that's going to have a very formal tone. If you're writing a blog, that's just a few hundred words, that might be a much more casual tone. And it's because you'd probably have different people reading blogs versus peer-reviewed papers. And it goes along with the expectations. So there's no real hard and fast rules about the ideal tone of a poster, for instance, but I'm going to suggest that something that's a little less formal might hit that mark of those criteria I mentioned before. It'll be a little bit more memorable, a little bit more understandable, a little bit more engaging, to be a little less formal than you might otherwise be or in a journal article, for instance. And then the third thing about understanding your audience is that when you know your audience, you can include the appropriate level of detail. So once again, journal articles are very long, very detailed, whereas blogs are much shorter and are really focused on just your few kind of key takeaway messages. So You know, I've been to presentations, for instance, with government employees who work on, say, Lake Erie nutrient issues, and the presenter will spend the first 10 minutes providing all of the background information about the history of Lake Erie and algal blooms. And I'd say that for the most part, it's not that helpful to provide all of that information because your audience pretty much knows it. You should probably try to keep your intro much more succinct and short and get right to your point, because what they're interested in learning is what your science is showing them that's new about the issue. But on the other hand, if you're presenting to a high school class, for instance, then they would want to know, they probably don't know what an algal bloom is, so they would need much more background information to get them up to speed so that you can talk about the next pieces of your research. So in thinking about who's going to be at this GWF meeting, there's actually a few different audiences who are there. So we're going to have a lot of global water futures, researchers, staff, HQP. We're going to have other academics who are also working in water, mostly from Canada, although there might be a few international representation there. And there's also going to be some water practitioners, people who are working in this field. These are going to be people from the federal and provincial government agencies. There's going to be people from water think tanks and NGOs. There's going to be people from local municipalities and watershed organizations. I suspect we'll see some people from the natural resources industry, consulting companies, people like that. So there's going to be a broad audience. And one of the questions that I often get when I make presentations like this is, how do you target, how do you write a presentation for a target audience when there's going to be a whole bunch of different kinds of audiences there? Well, a very helpful analogy is to think about it as a bullseye. So you want to make sure that your message hits and resonates with your key target audience. And then if your message also makes its way out to secondary and tertiary audiences, that's a nice advantage, a nice plus, but it's not your most important goal. So your most important goal is to really hit that target audience, and that's who you really want to spend the most amount of time identifying. These are people who are going to find your presentation highly interesting and helpful for their own purposes. So for instance, your target audience would be someone who you would want to make sure they sort of read your whole poster. A secondary audience might find some of your findings helpful or interesting, but they're probably interested in fewer of the details. So they might just kind of want a high-level summary. They might be the people who like read the abstract of a paper, but not necessarily read the rest of it. So from a poster presentation perspective, these people might come, they might skim your title and your headlines, they might look at your visuals, but they're not necessarily reading each word. Maybe they're not exactly in the same subject field as you. And then a tertiary audience is sometimes also called a hidden audience from a science communications perspective. And this includes all those who kind of fall outside of the primary or secondary audiences. They could be someone who maybe shares a common interest with either the primary or secondary audience, or is just sort of an indirectly interested recipient of your document or your presentation. So at this poster presentation, that might include maybe people who are working on different areas of science, but maybe in the same geography as you, or maybe you have a common stakeholder. And so there is value in thinking about who your tertiary audience is as well. So really things to remember here, different audiences are going to be interested in different types of messages. Write your message according to your target audience and be really strategic and thoughtful in how you're putting that together. And also think about how the design of your poster is going to appeal to your target audience. So that concludes section number 1 of my presentation, where I kind of outline some very high level principles that are going to apply to whatever presentation you're putting together. Now I wanted to talk a little bit more specifically about posters. So one thing to know is that if you are presenting a poster in May in Saskatoon, your poster is going to have to fit on a 45 by 45 inch board. It can be landscape or portrait, totally forgetting the word. And GWF is also going to ask, just as a heads up, they're going to ask for a digital copy of your poster because we're trying to collect some of that information for the GWF legacy research outputs. There's no template that you need to use. We're not going to give that to you. So there's flexibility with regards to how you're going to put your content together. And just if you haven't submitted an abstract in order to present a poster, that is due April 30th, just as a reminder. So really key when you're putting your poster together is to think about how do you create a great experience for yourself as the presenter? How do you set yourself up well so that you can present your content in a way that's going to be engaging and exciting for people and understandable, but also think about it from your audience's perspective. Make sure that your reader also has a great experience with your poster. So in the next few slides, I'm going to try to convince you that even relatively simple changes to the format of your poster can improve both your experience as a presenter and also the reader's experience. I'm going to start with a few minutes. I have 3 minutes of a video that I wanted to show you because I think it does a really great job of articulating why we should be rethinking how we put posters together. So I'm going to, hopefully the sound and everything works.
Every year at hotels all over the world, scientists from every field in science flock to these giant academic conferences. They're like Woodstock for geeks in that field. Scientists go to these conferences to learn about the new research going on in their field and to share the work they're doing with everybody else, and to drink and hang out with friends from other universities who they don't get to see very often. So it's like a big social knowledge update for the whole field. And at most all of these conferences, there's something called a poster session. And poster sessions are where researchers share findings that didn't fit into bigger sessions or bigger presentations. Scientists take some new research findings, some new truth about the world, and they try to explain it on this giant poster. These poster sessions are one of the main ways that scientists share knowledge with each other, and they have the potential to be this really great experience for both the person presenting the poster and the person walking around looking at all the posters. But in reality, scientists have mixed feelings about poster sessions. A lot of us go into poster sessions feeling like kind of optimistic, and then we come out feeling like disappointed and underwhelmed. Here's why. First, here's what it feels like to present a poster. If you're going to be the person presenting the poster, you're first thinking like, oh, this will be great. I'll put all this work that I'm really passionate about on this big, beautiful poster. People will walk by and be like, oh, cool research. And I'll be like, oh, you think so? Let's talk about it. And then we'll have this really engaging conversation where like I learn things, they learn things. Other people will walk by and be like, oh, great research. And they'll get to learn what I'm doing. I'll feel like I'm getting to share what I'm doing with the world and with other scientists. And sometimes, like very, very rarely, you will get like half of that experience. But that's the best case. Most of the time, you're standing by your poster all eager while people just walk by you and don't even look at your poster as if you don't exist, while you try to like stare them down out of desperation, like, please, someone respond to my work. And then the whole hour of the poster session goes by and no one is not just engaged with your poster, but no one has looked at your poster. And then you just take your poster down and you look at it and you remember that it cost $100 to print, and then you throw it away. And then you think, maybe my research wasn't that interesting anyway, and that was a complete waste of time. Now, here's how it feels to attend a poster session. The experience of attending a poster session and walking around trying to learn from all the posters can be even worse than it is for the presenter. Okay, it's not worse than it is for the presenter. Nothing's worse than presenting a poster session, but still pretty bad. Again, you start off with very high hopes. You picture yourself walking through and like breathing in all the latest research in your field, learning stuff you never thought to think about before, and really just like getting more enlightened as a scientist and getting all new ideas for the stuff you're doing. But it never, ever works out that way. In reality, most of the time you walk in and there's always presenters standing there by all their posters, and they're like locking eyes with you and watching you as you pass because they're also bored and desperate for you to engage with them and like validate their research. And their posters are just like walls of incomprehensible text that you can't interpret very quickly. So what you do is you kind of like avoid the too intense eye contact of the presenters while trying to quickly and surreptitiously scan the titles of the posters, trying to get an idea of one or two you might want to check out. And the title of the poster just sort of gives you a general idea of what the study did, like the research question they asked, not even the answer. And it's kind of abstract and a little too technical, but if you can get the general idea, then maybe you engage with the poster and try to get closer and try to figure out what they did and try to learn something. So you found a poster that you're kind of interested in and you walk up closer to get a general idea, scan it, read it, try to learn it.
There's a little flashiness there. I'm not sure if you guys saw that on your end too. But anyways, I'm only going to show you that bit because it's a 19-minute long presentation, and it'll kind of be like cheating maybe if I leave you guys to just watch a video instead of teaching you myself. But anyways, I really, you'll get a copy of my slide deck afterwards, and you'll see up here, there's a link to this video. I'd encourage you to watch the rest of it because I think that they make some really good points. And I hope that that sort of resonated with you, that makes sense in terms of your experience with poster presentations. So instead of watching that, the rest of it, I'm going to kind of summarize some of the main points. But basically, this guy who's created this presentation, he argues that the traditional way of designing a poster, which is up here on the screen, is unproductive for both the presenter and the audience, like you said. You know, traditional posters, there's not a lot there to grab your attention really quickly, other than maybe looking at the title. And the title sort of usually looks like a journal article title. It's or it might be a research question and not the answer. So it's, unless you're really specifically interested in that subject area matter, then you probably won't engage very much further. And most posters are burying their leads. Like, what's the conclusion from this poster that's on the screen? It's really hard to find what their finding is. So if they're burying their lead, then it's really hard to get insights from the poster, like he explained. So then your attendees aren't learning. It's an uninspiring format. That's, you know, we've got abstract background, methodology, results, discussion. The guy goes on to explain that poster after poster like this is a wall of mess because it's just a lot of content that's really hard to take in. And presenters are kind of assuming when they put something like this together that someone is going to take 10 minutes or so to kind of read every sentence that you've written from front to back. And that's not aligned with reality. That's not how people are usually reading posters. Instead, they kind of come, they're trying to get a sense of what the topic is. They'll skim it. They'll maybe look for the pictures or graphs and try to understand. They might read the conclusions, but they're not necessarily reading it in the order that you think. And so try to anticipate some of that when you're putting your poster together, when you're trying to figure out what format you're going to be using. Let's see if I can change my slide. Oh, it's there we go. Okay, so how do you make your posters better? Like I said, you can finish watching that video, and he actually suggests a different type of format altogether. And feel free to test that out for the Global Water Futures meeting. I'd really encourage you to think about that. But even if you don't want to adopt the exact same format and style that he's recommending in that video, I want you to take away 3 recommendations, or at least think about changing your poster to think about these kinds of 3 main points. Okay, so the first is put your punchline first. What's the most important key message, key finding that you have to communicate to people? One way to do that is to change the title of your presentation from something like you'd see in a journal article to the actual finding of your research paper. So think about making, and then turn that into plain language so that anyone can understand it. And make it big and bold so that it's easy to see on your poster. So someone's just walking by, they're going to be able to read that one sentence, that phrase, understand what your finding is, and then that's going to either draw them in or they'll know immediately that that's not the insight that they're looking for. So once again, make sure that that's highly visible and big and bold. And then also think about translating your headlines, your subtitles, into sub-key messages as well. Second, make sure that the content on your posters is easy to understand. So ways to do that, the first thing is reduce the amount of text on your poster. Make it quicker to read, quicker to digest. Consider using bullets instead of full sentences. That's much easier to skim. Thinking about, like I said, using more descriptive titles to help with the skimming of the content, and make it simple. Avoid jargon. This is not about you trying to look smart to the people you're presenting to. It's about them understanding the content. So it's much more important that you put that in plain language than to try to use all the technical words to make sure that they know that you know what you're talking about. And then the third tip is to use visuals. It immediately makes your poster more engaging, attractive, and memorable. And it makes it easier to scan. It makes it way more fun to look at. So I have a couple more slides that talk about visuals specifically. So as the video showed us, most posters at conferences just are walls of text. And it can be quite easy to just spruce up your poster with a few pictures. So I want you to try to put as much effort into the visuals that you're picking as the words that you are using, because visuals can help with all those three principles that I mentioned. It can help it make it more understandable, more engaging, more memorable. So I have a little map here of Belgium, and it's a very detailed map. You know, it provides a picture of all of the different possible roads. But if I was using this map to send you to somewhere specific in Belgium, it wouldn't be that helpful because there's too much detail. So it's the same sort of thing with your poster. If you're trying to lead someone to a certain conclusion, to a certain place to understand, they don't need every single road on the map. They might need just kind of one logical pathway to follow. So think about it like that. Visuals can be photographs. So if you want to, it could be pictures of you taking samples in the field, talking to stakeholders. Think when you use pictures, faces are a really good thing to include. People like looking at people for some reason. You can also think about visuals as infographics, and I'll talk a little bit more of that. And visuals are also graphs, of course. So this is a poster from a presentation that I went to late last year. The keynote speaker was talking about her research in Clyde River, Nunavut. And it was really neat because she partnered with a photographer and they had pictures of his work of Nunavut scattered around the room. And I think that it was a very nice compliment to her words, to her talk, because you could get a sense of the place through the visuals that you wouldn't necessarily be able to get to through words alone. So one of her main messages in her talk was that the Arctic is often thought of by people in the South, maybe, or people who haven't visited it, as being kind of this vast expanse of cold and ice. And if you're like a policymaker trying to create policies for this area, it might be easy to ignore the role of people and community. So her pictures try to demonstrate that it's actually a place full of life, full of character, full of culture. And those things need to be integral when you are presenting, or when you're trying to you know, create policies or do research in the North. So like I said, another type of visual is to use infographics. So this meme here, it tells a story with very few words. It's talking about how wetlands, or how destroying wetlands and floodplains can lead to more flooded homes. And they do that through a couple really simple illustrations. So if you want to go ahead and try testing out using some infographics in your posters, here's a few tips. One, just start by sketching it with your hand. A simple hand drawing lets you get your ideas out relatively quickly, so you don't have to be fiddling trying to learn to use a new software, but start with what you actually want. Making several quick sketches can help you brainstorm what you're doing visually. And detail and refinement don't matter at this point. The sketch just shows the element that's going to be in the graphics, the overall composition, the story flow. The second thing that I'd say is make sure you consider the reading order. So people typically read from the top left and down. So make sure that if you're using an infographic, people are following that logically so that you have a clear story. The third tip here is clear focus. A good infographic is not an encyclopedia of everything that you know about a topic. It should have a very strong focus on explaining just one thing very well and very succinctly. So then you can just discard everything else that doesn't support that one idea. So you're really editing very strongly and taking out anything unnecessarily during that sketching phase. And then the final tip here I'll give you is to use a very simple color scheme. That's complementary. You don't need to be using a whole whack of colors. That tends to be pretty distracting. I know that's a very quick overview of infographics, but I don't have time to dig into how to teach you how to do a complete infographics course. But there's lots of resources on the web that you can be Googling if you're interested in looking at that. Okay, so the next tip here is around graphs. Now, usually when I walk into a poster session, there's walls of text and walls of graphs. And a lot of the graphs are very detailed, but I'd say leave those detailed graphs for the journal article. What you need to be thinking about on a poster is something that's very simple, and make sure that it communicates your research through key messages. So if you want a graph, the first thing you need to do is pick the right type of graph. Each data has a limited number of chart types that are correct to use. It's not really a matter of taste. So among the correct charts that you can use for your data set, try to strive for the one that's the most clear and revealing. So think about it like that. What's revealing? Clear graphs communicate your message at a glance. So you shouldn't have to sit there and try to read and understand, but you should be able to quickly skim it and understand what that message is. So take a look at this graph that I have on the screen. I pulled this from an infographic, so it had a larger amount of context describing the shift in plant biodiversity with glacial retreat. So there's some features here that make it much clearer to get the message. So the X and Y axes are very clearly labeled using plain language. It's self-explanatory. The numbers on the X and Y axis are simple, legible, so you don't need every little dot representing everything. They've taken out kind of unnecessary detail. And then consider the title. It's the finding and not just the question. It's your takeaway message. So if people read nothing else, they'll at least understand that. And then color is really interesting how they used this. So they used blue to show the increase. They used red to show the decrease. So once again, if you want to learn more about how to create great graphs, there's lots of resources online for that as well. Okay, so this is my third section. And it's a little bit shorter than the other two, but I did want to focus a little bit on lightning talks as well. So at the GWF meeting, those who are giving lightning talks are going to be given a maximum of 2 minutes. There's going to be 7 talks in each of the 15-minute slots that they've scattered throughout the 3 days of the conference. And there's a total of 5. So abstracts were due Friday, last Friday. So if you did not submit a lightning talk abstract, then you will probably most likely not be giving a lightning talk. For anyone who signed up, this will be great for you. But lightning talks are asked, students are asked to give lightning talks all the time. So I hope that this can be helpful to you as well. So typically lightning talks, if you're asked to give it at a conference, is between 2 and 5 minutes, kind of depending on how much time they have. And because of how brief they are, it's really important to figure out how to make your point clearly. And so you're ridding the presentation of all of the non-critical information that doesn't support that main point. And when you're able to do this well, lightning talks are really effective at communication of your main points, because attendees tend to pay more attention. They only have to pay attention for 2 minutes, so they usually are listening to every single word, and they're able to get a broader array of knowledge when they're done well. So here's some tips for a lightning talk. Okay, so number 1, write a script. I hope that that's not too much of a surprise. And here, when you're writing your script, you can draft it a few times, but really you're going to be using fewer words than you think. You're going to start with a hook, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail in the next slide. You're going to explain, I mean, this is just one way of maybe putting together an outline or a script for a lightning talk. There's other ways, but this is quite simple if you don't know where to start. So after your hook, you're going to talk about how your research will contribute to solving that problem that you just described. You're going to talk about why you are qualified to do it, and then you're going to close. So in terms of a strong hook, take, say, the first 20 seconds to really engage your audience. This is the first sentence, the first thing that you're going to tell them, and it's your opener, and you want to make sure that they listen and then are like, oh, I better pay attention to the full 2 minutes because this is really interesting for me. So instead of just being like, hi, my name is Nancy, blah, 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 I work in this office, you could say something like, did you know that every single week the average person consumes the equivalent of a credit card's worth of plastic? That is engaging, scary. Then you can go on. My name is Nancy Goucher, and I'm here to tell you about what research I'm doing to solve this problem. That's the first step. The second tip here is to really avoid the details. You can't go into a lot of details when you only have 2 minutes. So it's really important to think about what's your key message. That's, say, the one sentence that you need people to hear. And then everything else is going to be supportive and built around that. It's not about summarizing your research. Like I've said, you're going to go crazy trying to do that in 2 minutes, but it's about delivering that very clear message. So your message needs to relate to your audience, ideally. So they have to see the importance of your research as it connects to them in an ideal way, or sort of the bigger picture. And that's the sort of second big tip, that you need to explain why. Why does this matter? Why is your research so important? You can do that through the hook, but you can also do that through some of the supporting statements. So this slide, obviously knowing your audience, I already talked about that, but I actually think it's worth repeating. And I wanted to just specifically mention that with respect to the lightning talk. So once again, remember, this audience at the GWF meeting is going to be academics, practitioners. You can't be talking to everyone. So make sure that you pick your target audience and create your clear message for what you want them to take away from your lightning talk. So for example, if I was going to talk about research that's trying to quantify the amount of microplastics in drinking water, I might create a talk that specifically tries to answer questions for people who are working in drinking water utilities, for provincial policymakers who are working on drinking water policy, or for other microplastics research who are also trying to quantify plastic in samples. It's important to be that specific with your audience so that you can create a message that makes sense to them, that they're going to remember. Okay, so the next tip around lightning talks is remembering that you need to build confidence. You need to demonstrate that you are confident in this material. So what does confidence look like? Speaking slowly, being clear and loud. Make sure that's really important. I hear a lot of people do talks. They're speaking so softly that you can't hear them, and then your message is not getting across. Think about eye contact. Think about walking around, using the stage, using the space that you have. A talk, no matter how quick or short it is a performance. So think about that. Practice that. And so the last tip here is really considering your timing very carefully. You only have 2 minutes. You want to make sure that you finish within that 2 minutes. It can help to try to memorize your 2 minutes and to also maybe know where you should be after a minute and a half, and in the last couple of seconds. So we're going to have time markers to show you where you're at, and you'll be able to time yourself according to those. So that's it actually for my talk. We have about 15 minutes for questions. So I'm not sure exactly how you want to handle this. Do you want people to add questions to the chat box? Can they unmute themselves? I'm
I
gonna
think,
stop sharing.
however folks are most comfortable in asking questions, I think is great. Thank you, Nancy, for that very insightful workshop. I know I learned quite a bit, and I'm not going to be presenting at the GWF finale, but I'll definitely keep some of those topics and themes in mind, in particular, knowing how to target your audience. I think that one's key.
I think so too.
Yeah, so if anyone has any questions, either specifically about the workshop material or just in general presenting or speaking or designing posters, by all means, feel free to pop it in the chat or unmute and fire your question. I guess, Nancy, I do have one question for you off the bat, because it's so difficult sometimes to pick and choose the right things to put on your poster because your research might be so interesting to you and there's so much you want to share. Is there value in making kind of like a supplementary materials to your poster where you might have, say, I don't know, a QR code or something that you put on your research poster that people can then scan, and then, you know, if they're really interested in what you're doing, to pursue that further? Or is that kind of unnecessary clutter? Or are there better ways of doing that?
So if you watch the video to the very end, that is what the author suggests, is that you have a QR code that allows people to go and read the full paper. I'm a big fan, when thinking about communication, of thinking about it in different levels. And so the first and most important thing that people always need to hear, no matter how much detail they want, is what your key message is. So make sure that that key message and the few sort of sub key messages are very easy to scan, very findable. Then you want to provide the next layer of information if people are a little bit more interested. So you could consider that to be, say, 3 to 5 really high level bullets under each of those titles, so that they can dig in a little bit more. And then there's going to be a few people who are so keen that they do want to learn more. They really want to dig in and see the detailed graphs. They want to read every detail about your methodology. Maybe they want to replicate it or something like that. That's really important for them to have access to your paper. So a QR code's an excellent idea to lead them to that. Or if you have other sort of detailed descriptions of your research, a web page or something like that. I think that that's a really strategic and thoughtful way of putting together a communication piece. And that can be applied to presentations, to say, if you put a one-page summary together of your research, it's always a good idea to provide that for more information. For those who are really keen, here's the full set of information.
Cool.
But I think the trick is that people assume that everyone wants the full level of detail. So I'm saying, flip it on its head and assume everyone just wants the key messages and just a few people want to go a little bit further. So that's the key.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Any other questions or thoughts? Anybody concerned about anything as they're thinking about their posters? Or lightning talks?
I guess your presentation was just perfectly clear and answered all of the questions that anyone might have had. It was just that excellent. Okay. Well, in the absence of any questions, we can wrap up the workshop. I'll stop recording now.